Supreme Court of Appeals has dismissed government's appeal against the High Court in Pretoria's ruling that the Sudanese President Omar Al-Bashir should have been arrested. Earlier, the High Court ruled that South Africa, as a signatory to the Rome Statute, was obliged to arrest Al-Bashir and hand him over to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. The Supreme Court has ruled that it was unlawful for government to allow the President Al-Bashir to leave the country after the High Court ruled that he should not have been allowed to leave. Bashir was in the country last June attending the African Union Heads of State Summit. Government had argued before the court that Bashir was given immunity to travel to attend the summit. Bashir is wanted for crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court for war crimes committed in Darfur, where more than 300,000 people were killed.
The conduct of the respondents in failing to take steps to arrest and detain for surrender to the International Criminal Court the President of Sudan, Omar Al-Bashir, after his arrival in South Africa on the 13th of June 2015 to attend the 25th Assembly of the African Union, was inconsistent with South Africa's obligations in terms of the Rome Statute and Section 10 of the implementation of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court Act 27 of 2002 and unlawful. 2. The applicant is entitled to the costs of the application on a pro bono basis. The appeal is otherwise dismissed. 6. The applicants are to pay the respondents' costs of appeal and the costs of the Helen Suzman Foundation, including the costs of its application for admission as an amicus, such costs to include in both instances the costs consequent upon the employment of two counsel. I hand the judgment down.
Well, there you have it. The Supreme Court of Appeals has dismissed government's appeal against the High Court in Pretoria's ruling that the Sudanese President Omar Al-Bashir should have been arrested last year. Now, for the latest on this, we're now cross live to our reporter Jack Parrock, who's in Brussels in Belgium. Jack, a very good morning to you and welcome. And can you tell us, with the Supreme Court of Appeal now in South Africa having dismissed the Al-Bashir case, what does this mean for the ICC?
Well, it's a very, very interesting ruling from the Supreme Court in South Africa. And what it means is that the ICC will now feel more justified in their pursuance of the South African government for an explanation in what happened. As soon as Al-Bashir was in South Africa for this AU summit, the ICC prosecutor said that the South African government was obliged and must arrest the Sudanese president and transfer him to The Hague under their obligations under the Rome Statute, which is the statute that founds the International Criminal Court, of which South Africa was a founding member. And in fact, the Rome Statute, parts of it are actually enshrined into South African law itself without just the international obligations. So the ICC was very, very keen, very quickly, that once Omar Al-Bashir was allowed to leave South Africa after the AU summit, that they wanted to start a proceeding in requesting information about why the South African government had chosen not to do that. That proceeding is still ongoing. The judges at the ICC are still looking into this. But it's essentially been on hold for a short while this was going through the South African courts. So now the ICC will pursue their investigations probably more fervently against the South African government and ask for a direct explanation on why they didn't hand over the Sudanese president.
Now, a lot of firepower now handed to the ICC, so to speak. When can we then expect information from the ICC on the matter?
Well, this is going through the chambers of the court, and it can be timings can be very difficult to judge. But I would expect that the court will come out with something in the next week or so. At the Assembly of States Parties of the International Criminal Court, which is the kind of body which all the member countries go to annually to discuss the proceedings of the court every year in The Hague. Back in November, we heard the International Relations Minister of South Africa, Maita Nkwana Mashabane, stand up and give a very scathing speech to that body. We also heard the Justice Minister as well be incredibly critical of the ICC. So it's going to be an interesting kind of friction between the South African government and their ministers and the International Criminal Court after the kind of hard rhetoric they spoke out against the International Criminal Court. But the ICC essentially just wants this explanation to come. They want to know why South Africa didn't arrest the Sudanese president. He's been indicted twice by the court for his alleged crimes in Darfur, which killed around 300,000 people, essentially. So they are looking to really just get Omar Al-Bashir arrested and transferred there, and they want to know why South Africa didn't aid them in that. We'll have to wait and see. This could cause some quite tense moments between South Africa and the court. The African Union has been incredibly critical of the ICC and called for a Pan-African withdrawal of signatories from the Rome Statute.
Now, we can probably expect a lot more from that, but what are the other possible implications of this ruling, not just for South Africa, but also on the ICC as a whole?
Well, internally in South Africa, obviously, it's difficult for the government politically, but as far as it goes with the ICC, if the ICC judges decide that South Africa didn't fulfill their obligations under the Rome Statute, really there's not so much they can do apart from kind of a hand slap and a condemnation from the other countries. Really where this can affect is at the United Nations. The United Nations Security Council and South Africa's aspirations to become more influential there could be hampered by this non-compliance, is what the ICC sees it as, in not handing over the Sudanese president. But how it all plays out, we'll have to wait and see what happens when the court looks into what South Africa essentially did and their explanations on what happened.
Now, I know it's a little bit far-fetched, but maybe to speculate, what are some of the sanctions that South Africa can face by the ICC?
The ICC essentially has no power to sanction the South African government, but as I said, it would be the United Nations that could take a hard line. I don't think we would expect any sanctions on a matter of this nature. I think that might be too far-fetched potentially to go. But with regards to kind of power and negotiating power on other issues, that's where it could affect South Africa in the UN in New York. So it will be probably a difficult political position. Probably actually this ruling today from the Supreme Court in South Africa is much more difficult for the government domestically rather than internationally. Really now what we see is what the International Criminal Court says in their response and what the judges decide as far as South Africa's alleged non-compliance in not handing over the Sudanese president.
And then just finally, Jack, can you give us an update on what's currently happening at the ICC today?
Today there is the ongoing Bemba trial. Next Monday, actually, we're seeing the judgment in that trial. The former vice president in the transitional government of the DRC, who's alleged to have mass crimes in the Central African Republic. So that's a big judgment to come out. The International Criminal Court has only had 2 convictions in its decade-long history. So the ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda is really looking for another conviction to the ICC's name.
Jack, thank you so much for that update. That was our reporter in London, Jack Parrock. In fact, he is at the ICC giving us that latest update there.